Like some sort of like food thing that's actually targeting. A lot of this I think almost everything is but like a lot of the stuff that plastic bags.
Most people buy their I can't really explain this. Yeah, and also like those red meat far most people buy
during my job. You know what I virgin olive oil, and I said, I'm always oil is oil. And he said, the way I grew up, there is no such thing. That's the way olive oil has to be, you know. And my son, this is they make it so complicated. They have to pay more money. Wait, it doesn't.
Okay, maybe we can come back together here and share, if anybody would like to, or if any of the groups had any ideas for changes that could be made, or even reflections and celebration of changes that have been made. I'm very curious to hear what you all have come up with. Yeah.
I've been into shopping at thrift stores for clothes because I view fast fashion as like a huge problem. Like I only go to thrift stores like this thrift store, and it's also way less expensive.
Beautiful. So shopping for clothes only at thrift stores, and you view fast fashion as, what was the word? Problematic?
Yeah, very
problematic. And it turns out that you get a financial benefit from this as well. Cool, I love that. I love those layered wins. That is part of what we're talking about when we're talking about cultivating thriving, is layered wins. Yeah?
Over the past year, I became a vegetarian. And I didn't do it for health reasons, but mainly for ethical reasons, just because we waste so much carbon and water energy in order to process mainly the red meat in, like, especially in the United States. And that's for some parts of the country, a huge staple of their diet is meat, like Burger King, Wendy's, McDonald's. So like by simply reducing your intake of meat or red meat specifically, you're lessening your carbon footprint, and also it's way cheaper to not eat meat. So yeah, that's just one way.
Thank you for sharing that. So you have, in the past year, become vegetarian and made a commitment not to use the resources that go into meat production, and you're saying that in particular how we do red meat production is especially resource intensive, water and carbon specifically. Thank you. Yes?
Mine was more in a confession. At my age, probably not knowing or being aware of so many poisons that are in the environment, that are in the home. I was thinking today, I cleaned the toilet and I used Lysol, and the cat was around, and it was sort of like, get away, it's messing in my toilet. And it was like, I have no idea really what's in that product.
Yes.
I have no idea. And flush it, goes down Lake Michigan.
Yes.
And it's something that I know now that I really have to make a point to become more aware and not just become aware, but make changes.
Make changes. Beautiful. Thank you. I love hearing that. It speaks to, and you know, for those of us who have clean toilets, I've done a fair share of that myself. It speaks to, there's a certain humility in all of this. And we have a whole lot of products that are poisonous to ourselves, to our pets, to even friends, family, neighbors, and of course our surrounding environs. And my goodness, you know, we've got folks, some of us, spraying things in the yard that right on the material safety data sheet indicates that, you know, it's dangerous for children, it's dangerous for pets, and all we need to do is choose whether that's something we want to do. And I appreciate sharing, and you know, the good news is there are so many biodegradable, relatively harmless products we can use to clean toilets and other parts of the house and everything. And as we as consumers choose to purchase those more and more, we actually end up in a scenario where price parity occurs, and often the higher quality, safer, and cleaner products can end up being the cheaper choice in time. So that's one of the beautiful things about how economy works, and we see this on thin margins in the food world. We see this in some of the chemical and household product world. And so as more and more of us make these kinds of choices, we're gonna see the economics come right along with us. Thank you. Anybody else? All right. Very good. So, Mike and I were talking last night, and with Megan as well, and talking about how in the Catholic tradition, there's a sense of the economy of our own self and body, that oikos that comes up. And I'm not a theologian. I'm not going to attempt to unpack that for you all. But I will suggest that when we're thinking about economy, we can think about it in three scales: the self, the community, and the earth. And I think we find in traditions, a few references were made earlier to some of our Native American traditions. We find traditions all over the world. We find in the Catholic tradition a rich heritage that presents a framework and presents a very robust and holistic way of thinking about all of this. And we are all, it's interesting sometimes to me that we often end up sort of fascinated by and almost aggrandizing what we call Native American culture. And there's a lot to think about and a lot of healing to think about there in the way that all these different cultures have come together in time. But one of the things I would encourage each of us to consider is that we're all indigenous. We're all native people to this planet. And in our own personal histories, it's only a matter of going back far enough in time to get to where our different families and our different groups of people would have been living in a manner that would appear to us to be characterized as being more indigenous in nature. So this is something we're all carrying inside of us. And we have an opportunity now in this era to take some of what's good from different times, different eras, and different cultures and marry them together with what's good from our own time and culture and tradition. And so what if we all behaved as if we truly were indigenous and from one common humanity and human tribe on this planet? Community and self and earth. In the sustainability world, this is thought of as working to benefit people, planet, and make profit in the world of business. And more of us are, if not already doing this kind of work, going to have the opportunity to do this kind of work in the world. And guess what happens as more and more of us skilled, intelligent, and educated folks choose to work in the arenas of sustainability? Guess who ends up with competitive advantage? Guess who ends up with the most innovative communities of people helping to create the future? I assure you, some of the biggest corporations are starting to get really scared at the brain drain effect. The fact that more and more folks who have incredible skills and talents want to be working in service to Earth and in service to humanity, period. And many of the large corporations are now trying to make changes in that direction, sometimes through acquisition, sometimes through innovation, but frankly, a lot of them are a bit nervous now about this brain drain. We live in a time when innovation is starting to occur at such rapid pace that we're seeing a whole lot of shifting and changing out there in the marketplace. And that all comes down and starts with one thing: each of us. Right, Patrick? Yeah. And each of us is also an ecosystem. And when we're thinking about how we think, it behooves us to become expert stewards, guardians at the gate of what it is we're allowing to influence our thinking, our thoughts, our feelings, and so forth. And to become expert at understanding where all these influences are coming from and how much and when we're going to allow certain influences in. This is books we read, this is conversations we have, this is friendships we have in some cases. It gets at what motivates us. And these next couple slides, just to drop a seed with you all, who's heard of Maslow's hierarchy of needs? Okay, great. So you're probably familiar with this, having a sense that one must first achieve or satisfy a layer or level before going to the next, right? So one must have things like food and shelter before worrying about things like, esteem and accomplishment, right? In Maslow's career early on, he posited 5 levels, the apex of which is self-aware growth and actualization. I like to think of this as like Michael Jordan, right? Like if you've got a set of gifts and talents, and you cultivate those to be the very best they can be. He realized later in his career that there's actually something beyond cultivating our skills and talents for our own sake, for its own sake. And that is putting those cultivated skills and talents in service to the world and to humanity. And that he calls self-transcendence. And I believe as more and more of us choose to do this around the world, we are going to see a very rapid change and shift within a matter of years and create the kind of future we really want. Now, what this also means is that we're not going to make our career choices just in order to make the most possible money in the shortest period of time, live in the best zip code possible, and drive the best car possible, right? It actually comes down to making choices based on different values. And I think in our Catholic tradition and heritage, there is a rich and fertile ground for making a whole lot of choices based on more than just things like money. And this brings us to wele, one of my favorite words. Now, somebody said, over here, it was you, right? You know this word. Do you remember what it means?
Not 100%.
Not 100%, yeah. So this word comes to us from Middle English. And wele is the root from which we get the word wealth, right? Wealth. And boy, are we good. Maslow's hierarchy is essentially the map for the advertising industry, right? You want to get people to buy something, trigger their need to belong, and a few other needs or desires, and then you sell a whole lot of whatever it is you're trying to sell, right? We can get good at this. We can life hack our way through this and not be such susceptible consumers to the advertising we encounter. Remember back to this ecology of thinking? Now we get to choose what books we're reading. We get to choose perhaps even what media we're consuming, if maybe some television shows or what have you. One thing we don't really get to choose is all of the brand impressions we receive walking around, driving around, riding trains around, and so forth. There's a statistic by the time a child is something like 5 years old in our country, that child has received over 10,000 brand impressions and can recognize several hundred. You know, we are awash in this thing. And it's important to understand the Maslow's hierarchy piece of this to really start to begin to cultivate our own well-being. So waylay, which is our root word for this word wealth, originally means well-being. And when we're talking about cultivating well-being, that's the wealth that I hope we all pursue with tenacity. And within the framework of well-being, these other 4 essential nodes, nature, food, soil, and movement, are the keys that we have the opportunity in our own lives on a daily basis as a matter of sacred practice to engage and cultivate. And this is where we're getting at life hacking in terms of understanding how our own behaviors are influenced by pleasure centers, are influenced by our complex neurobiochemistry. These are things that some of the best and brightest on Madison Avenue, the advertising industry, have been working with since the 50s. We have the opportunity to rewrite, overwrite, and evolve what it is we're choosing to do and why. So in the cultivation of waylay, we've got things like appreciation, breathing, community, compassion, connection, contemplation, gratitude, joyfulness, knowledge, refreshment, rejuvenation, restfulness, slowing down, and wisdom. You could almost think of pursuing these things as an alternative to pursuing the new fill in the blank, the new whatever it is we might consume to try to enhance a sense of well-being, right? Often we purchase things wanting a sense of well-being and find it's pretty fleeting when it's through purchasing things. But when it's cultivating a life of connection to the sacred in our own day-to-day practices, it turns out that becomes very sustainable. And I want to talk a little bit about food. And I know we have at least one vegetarian in the room. But I have a question for y'all. Have you heard about this trend in the food world called organics, like organic vegetables? Right?
Yeah.
It's a fad or something. What do you think they called organic vegetables back in the time of St. Francis?
Vegetables.
Yeah, right. And okay, do we have any other vegetarians in the room? Yeah, a handful, okay. And there are some very interesting things for us to think about and choose when it comes to what we're eating. And for those of us who are eating meat, there is a whole spectrum of impacts environmentally, of welfare of animals and so forth in those decisions as well. And I'm just curious, does anyone happen to know when this university was founded?
Behind it, 1870.
What does it say there?
1870, it's on the logo.
1870, okay, that's the same as on the website I looked at last night. So 1870, so who's heard of this trend called grass-fed beef? Yeah. Guess what grass-fed beef was called back in 1870? Beef.
Beef.
Yeah. Yeah. So when we choose to buy and eat foods that were cultivated and prepared in a manner that they could have been 100, 150, 200 years ago and before that, we are getting a win-win. We're not only getting enhanced environmental benefits, we are also, by and large, getting much healthier foods for ourselves, right? This is something that I encourage you all to dive deeply into. Here's the grass-fed beef one. And I am personally extremely excited about the power we have in our food and beverage choices because A, we get to do this about 20 times a day, right? Like a meal, we're actually choosing 10, 12, 15 different things. A little bit of spice, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, right? And each one of those choices is a signal out into the marketplace, is affecting people, is affecting soil, is affecting water, is affecting the atmosphere. Every single one of those is also affecting our health. So this is something we get to do all the time, essentially. And I'll ask you to consider what it is that you're going to do with that. That's my grandpa on the left there, Grandpa Bear. Try organic food. That's what our grandparents called food. And then this is Joel Salatin, a hero of the regenerative and sustainable agriculture movement. Can you read what he's saying here? If you think organic food is expensive, have you priced cancer lately? We have laced our food system with carcinogens. We just have. And we can stop that right now. And we ought to. Now, we get to talk about all these pets we brought with us for blessings today, right? So our body has some trillion cells in it. I hear varying numbers. It's a heck of a lot. It's a number so big we can hardly even imagine it. And in those trillion or so cells in our body, over 90% of them, most, are not human DNA. They are non-human microbes, a whole lot of them found right in our digestive system. We're starting through science to get really smart about all of this. We're starting to understand that the microbial community in our guts is essentially driving our immune system, is essentially driving our mood. It's almost as if it's influencing how we think and experience life. We are starting to really understand that the microbial community in our guts is one of the main determinants as to how much serotonin we're producing. Does anyone know what serotonin does? What's it do?
Happiness.
Yeah, happiness. Makes us feel good. Exactly right. I think that's something we want more of, probably. And, probably some undesirable things happen when we don't have very much of that producing. And a whole lot of that production is being driven by the health, the relative health of the ecosystem in our guts and bodies. This is something we're influencing through our food. We know that there's a cluster of nerves in our gut around our digestive system that has more nerve cells than the entire spinal column, and that is sending all kinds of signals up to our brain, way more, orders of magnitude greater numbers of signals to the upper brain than the upper brain is sending down. We're actually beginning to wonder now, where does the body end and the mind begin, really? It's an integrated system. And similarly, in addition to the food and water, so by the way, with drink, water, right? And things like tea, herbal tea, and we have so many easy choices that are great for the pocketbook that probably would be a bit of a behavior change for many of us, and we're going to feel better as a result. Drinking more water is huge. Similarly with movement, we live in a time where we sit a lot. Many of us are sitting right now, right? The American Medical Association recently has discussed the diseases showing up in our culture are now greater, resulting from immobility, lack of movement, than those showing up as a result of tobacco use. There's a little bit of good news in there. Tobacco use is on the decline. Okay, that's great. But here's the deal. We sit a lot. Now, how many of you are students? Okay. And just a quick shout out, what are you planning to do in your career? If you know. Any ideas, directions? general directions?
Environmental engineering.
Environmental engineering, great.
Hopefully, environmental policy or planning.
Environmental policy or planning, awesome, love it.
Physical therapist.
Physical therapist, okay. You might be the exception to the point I'm about to make.
Psychologist.
Psychologist, great, yeah. Awesome, attorney, yeah. Did you have your hand up?
Nonprofit organizer.
Nonprofit organizer, okay, that's great, thank you.
Oh, sure. Political activist.
Political activist, thank you. So, for a lot of those jobs, what that ends up meaning is we're sitting at a desk a whole lot, right? We do a lot of sitting. And what that also means is we need or have an opportunity to do a whole lot more movement deliberately. Now, how many of us have a car? I have a car. Yeah, some of us have a car, okay. Now, how many of us have ever driven a car to a store? Okay, yeah. Now, when you drive a car to a store, where do you try to park? Close to the entrance, yeah. I mean, it's like a game. You're like, you know, someone pulls out, you get that front spot, you're like, yeah, I just won. And you're like, what'd you just win? And you're like, a bunch of fewer steps, you know? And it turns out, you know, we are so designed for walking. And again, science is showing up and telling us that literally, those of us who are choosing to walk more, day by day, week by week, our cognitive function is improved. Our cognitive function is improved. Who doesn't want better cognitive function? I mean, I don't know. Probably a lot of us do, right? And the walking is a choice in many respects as well, going up a few flights of stairs, if we're only going up to the second or third floor or whatever. And we live in a time when our technology, our transportation technology, and our lifeways has us sitting a whole lot. And it's contributing to a bunch of other challenges that we face individually and as a society. So the whole movement thing is part of this sacred practice of sustainability in our own lives and taking care of our own temple bodies. If you're interested, Dan Buettner wrote a book called Blue Zones, where he cataloged a handful of communities around the world where folks experienced unusual longevity and very high quality of life, very healthy lives, and discovered there were a few key commonalities having to do with movement and diet, community and relationships. It's a great read. I encourage you to check it out. Now, who's heard of nature deficit disorder? I hope our psychology. Your psychology. Yeah, you've heard of this, yeah? What is it?
Like has to do with like less exposure to the outdoors and like nature in general.
That's exactly right. Yeah. How many folks do you think suffered from nature deficit disorder in the time of St. Francis? It was virtually impossible because of a few things: numbers of people, patterns of development, proximity to things like forests and soil and so forth. We're now at a time when, for many of us, it is a choice to go and engage with nature. Now there's some interesting research coming out here as well. Literally 5 minutes looking at living trees. So I see a few that direction, I see a few this direction. Literally 5 minutes looking at living trees has a noticeable and measurable reduction of stress hormones in our bodies, right? We are just beginning to understand the complex chemistry. It's almost like hormones that trees put off when we're out walking among them, in terms of how they affect our health and well-being as well. A deep and visceral connection with nature, I believe, is requisite for those of us especially who are hoping to have a positive impact in the world. If we're not connected with nature, we might, even with the best of intentions, get a bit off course. Has anyone heard of Thomas Berry?
Oh, my hero.
Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful writer. I encourage you all to check him out. In the Catholic tradition, an incredible thinker and writer. And he wrote this book, The Christian Future and the Fate of the Earth. The chapter headings alone will blow your mind of this book. And what he says is, as we lose our experience of the songbirds, our experience of the butterflies, the flowers in the fields, the trees and woodlands, the streams that pour over the land, and the fish that swim in their waters, as we lose our experience of these things, our imagination suffers in proportion, as do our feelings and even our intelligence. What if that's actually true? What if you knew this actually to be true? What would you do differently? Day by day, week by week, month by month? Now this brings us to soil, and I'm going to pass around my last show and tell. This is authentic soil from Lurek. Came all the way. I encourage you to touch it. I'll tell you why in a minute. Smell it, touch it, check it out. Yeah. Thank you very much. So soil is the missing link, in my opinion, between sustainability and thriving. We talked a bit about the transition to a solar economy. We talked a bit about climate change, right? We talked about getting away from the fossil fuels and getting into solar energy production. And one of the main reasons we're doing that as rapidly as we can is that it means we release less fossil carbon into the atmosphere. So we talked about decarbonizing energy. And we're also talking about recarbonizing soil. The global community is now just about getting ready for a huge global party. We're setting the table, so to speak. And this party is going to be all about soil building. It turns out when we build soil, we are actually, in collaboration with the microorganisms in the soil, able to sequester carbon from the atmosphere and put it back down in the ground. That's amazing. We actually have a mechanism to undo what's been done. Soil is also, literally and figuratively, the place on our physical planet where the life and death spiral is continuously at work. Soil is where things that have died now decompose and become food for things that are living, right? And we can engage in this ourselves through things like composting. Turns out with composting, when we put organics into a little bin with a bunch of microorganisms that turn that back into great food while sequestering carbon, it is also a beautiful alternative to sending those same coffee grounds, banana peels, carrot cuttings, and so forth to the landfill, where in the landfill, it goes through a different type of decomposition process, often releasing methane, a very powerful greenhouse gas, into the atmosphere. So we have a choice. It's a beautiful either or. And for those of us who engage in building soil, guess what the science is beginning to tell us? Literally touching living soil interacts with our body, all those microorganisms. Could you hold up just a little handful? Just, yeah. Do you know, can you guess how many organisms are in there? 10,000, that's a great guess. That'd be a lot, wouldn't it? It's probably on the order of 1 billion. Right there. And when we talk about God's creation, when we talk about the glory, the beauty, the incredible miracle of God's creation, and we start to understand what's going on in the soil itself, I mean, I don't know why we wouldn't be brought to tears of joy. It's tremendous. Our work with soil heals us. We know many of our brothers and sisters returning from war, folks who have experienced trauma. One of the best ways we can recover is working with soil. We have all across the country programs with vets doing farming and soil building work as part of their healing and recovery process. It's amazing. And it brings us to our word, the Latin humus, right, for soil. And related to the word human, the word humility, the word humor, humanity, there's something in there for us. I believe in the next 10 years or so, 5, 10, we are going to see millions of us around the planet build soil in collaboration with microorganisms, and we are going to reverse climate change. That's what I believe is going to happen. And I believe it's going to be one of the coolest, biggest, most awesome parties our species has ever experienced on this planet. And guess what? It can happen in our lifetime. We get to be here for this. When we do the math, the amount of carbon we've released from fossil fuel burning from the beginning of the industrial era took us from about 280 parts per million to now we're over 400 parts per million. That's quite an increase by percent. That volume is roughly 243 billion tons of carbon. Now, there's a lot of carbon in the atmosphere, but guess what? There's a whole lot more carbon in the soil around the world. And to sequester that 243 billion tons of carbon equates to merely a 10% increase in soil carbon around the world. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of innovation. It's going to take a lot of cooperation, but it's doable. We can do this. Those of us who are charged, who are responding to the call, are, I think, going to see this as being a very significant part of our work in the coming years. And in addition to compost, we have biochar. Who's heard of biochar? Yeah. So this is a technique we can use with woody biomass to create a special kind of carbon, charcoal, that helps build soil and helps sequester carbon in the soil for many, 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 many years. The half-life is something over 1,000 years.